Hi there. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining me and Shovik here today. My name is Maria Wick-Vila. I'm a 2005 graduate of Harvard Business School, and I've been giving admissions advice now for over 15 years. I'm the founder of Applicant Lab, which is an online platform that replaces the need for expensive admissions consultants. It provides interactive guidance through everything you need to submit the strongest MBA application possible. So what we are going to do here today is that Shovik and I are going to do a mock MBA interview. Some of his answers might be not good on purpose because we want to be able to demonstrate the difference between perhaps what might not make a strong answer and what then will make a stronger answer. So I will ask him a question, he'll answer it, and then after that, I will give him feedback.
Well, I think to hide behind the on-purpose bad answer. That's awesome.
Well, I mean, also, you know, it's been a while since you've had to interview because you're now a student at Ross. So.
Yep. All right. So I guess we can start. We have 45 minutes. So
Great.
What we will do is we'll go through one question and then get feedback, and then we'll go to the next one. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Awesome.
All right. So, hi there, Shovik. How's it going?
It's going pretty great, Maria. How about you?
It's going very well. You know, as I introduced myself earlier, my name is Maria. I've been an admissions committee member here at Random University for the past 7 years. And so I'm excited to get to know you a little bit better. So why don't we start off with you walking me through your resume?
Sure. So as you can see, I graduated engineering in 2011. I think one of the reasons I did engineering in the college that I went to was because, you know, it was really prestigious and I was fortunate enough to get in, and I think that was a no-brainer for me. And then I did electrical engineering. I graduated in 2011. And then immediately after, I chose to work for the big industrial conglomerate. It's a German company, and I thought that would give me some global exposure. And I worked there for 2 years, and then I sort of pivoted to education, where I was a full-time teacher with Teach for India. And then after 2 years of teaching, I wanted to move to a more startup-y role. So I joined an education startup where we were a 9-member team. And then now I was their strategy lead for 3 years, and we grew to about 300 people. It was a really cool journey. And then I wanted to pivot to tech because tech was always my passion. So I came to business school to pursue, like a product management career, maybe in a big company like Microsoft or Google or Apple.
All right. Thank you so much for that. So now let's dissect some of the things that Shovik could have done better with that answer. Okay, so you started off by saying that you majored in engineering and that the reason you chose your college was because it's very prestigious.
Yeah.
Now, this could be a cultural difference thing, but at least in the US, even if we actually did secretly choose our college because it was prestigious, that's not the sort of thing you want to admit. When you do, or if you do talk about what you studied, you want there to be a real genuine passion for the subject that you studied, instead of simply saying like, well, I thought if I became an engineer, I could make a lot of money, or I went to this college just because my parents thought it would be a good idea. So if you are going to talk about that during the walk me through your resume, it doesn't have to, please don't mention any of these sort of shallow external factors for making the choices that you made. Then you said, I went to work for a German company because I thought it would give me global exposure. That was actually good, right? One of the things that you mentioned about why you chose that position was something that MBA admissions committees are very interested to know, right? Oh, this is someone who they look for people who have an international perspective. So you actually brought up the fact that this job gave you that global exposure. So that was a good thing. I put a little check mark next to that. You then proceeded to talk about Teach for India, and then the education startup that you went to work for. You were the strategy lead for 3 years, and you helped grow the business. The issue that I have with your Teach for India and startup description is that you didn't really tell me what your impact was on the organization. Right. So you said that like, oh, we went from 8 people or something like that to hundreds of people, but you didn't tell me what your role was in any of that. You didn't even tell me what you learned. Now, you might be thinking right now, well, Maria, I learned so many things in those jobs. How do I pick what to talk about, right? Because if I talk about everything I learned in the job, I'll be there for 3 hours. My advice to you is to pick things that either helped you grow as a manager and develop your leadership, interpersonal leadership skills, or anything that ties into your future career vision.
Right.
So since you mentioned at the end that you're looking to become a product manager, in that strategy job that you had, I know that part of what you were doing, I think, is that you were looking at ed tech solutions for education, if I remember correctly. So that would have been a very valuable thing to bring up, because then later on, when you are inevitably asked, what is it you want to do? You could then, in the reader's mind, they would say, oh, yeah, it makes sense that he wants to do product management in ed tech. He has experience in it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my feedback on that. All right. So you actually ended that question really well by hinting at what you want to do in your career, because normally after walk me through your resume, the next question is, so what do you want to do next? So let's just figure that out. So Shovik, thank you so much for that answer. What would you like to do with your career?
Yeah, so I came to business school partly because I wanted to shift to tech, like I mentioned, but also what I really see myself doing in the short term, which is maybe like a couple of years out of business school, is to be a PM in a big tech company, a similar company like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and then really learn the skills of how I can be at the intersection of design and engineering, and really learn from designers and engineers on a daily basis and shape products. And that would give me sort of a very robust toolkit that I can then use in the long term where I want to be an entrepreneur, either in the US or back in India. I'm still not really fixated on the geography yet, but that's what I want to do long term. I don't have a clear idea of what I really want to build my startup around. But I think I'm banking on the fact that the network that I built, both at Michigan and at the tech company that I choose to work in, would not only help me gather some ideas, but also help me gather the people that I would like to build my startup on, and also like help me with the network, because like San Francisco is like very useful if I ever want to get funding. So that's going to be pretty valuable as well. So those are sort of my short and long term goals. So yeah.
All right, great. Okay, so you started off by explaining you want to shift to tech, and in the short term, you want to get a product manager job. First of all, just as a minor note, you mentioned PM. I know that earlier in the interview, you had specifically mentioned the words product manager, but remember that admissions officers, they might be career-long admissions officers. They might have worked in human resources their entire career. So if you're tempted to throw around an acronym like PM or things like that, just make sure that you explain product manager so that they completely get what you're talking about. Then you said, I might want to work at a tech company such as Netflix, Amazon, Google. I can't remember the ones you mentioned. The problem with that is that those companies, they all get lumped in together as part of the big tech giants, but they are actually extraordinarily different companies. Amazon is doing e-commerce. Microsoft is doing primarily software sales. Netflix is an entertainment company. So yes, they're all digital tech companies, but in fact, they do very, very different things. So the experience you would get at an Apple versus an Amazon is probably going to be pretty different. So that makes it you sound like you don't really know what you want, or that you haven't really researched what these career paths are and what they lead to. Then you said, okay, I want to do it because it'll put me at the intersection of design and engineering. And here are the issues that you didn't tie in any of your previous skills to prove to me that you would be an attractive hire for these types of roles, right? At least I understand that sometimes in India, the college plays a much more active role in placing someone in a job. At least here in the US, there's it's really on you. Like the career services office will help you, and of course they'll make introductions, but it's really on you to persuade the employer to hire you. Yeah. So you need to be sure that you're letting me know as an admissions officer that you are in fact going to get the job by bringing up reasons that post-MBA employer would want to hire you. And then for your long-term goal, you said, well, I have no clear idea, maybe the US, maybe India. And the issue with that is that if you don't have a clear long-term goal, then why does that short-term product manager job even make sense? If you just sort of say, well, I think I want to start a company one day, I mean, you could be starting a pizza company, you could be starting an apps company, you could be starting any type of company. And so it doesn't necessarily, if you want to paint a picture, you do have to have a pretty specific idea. And you can say, look, this might change in the future, but right now, I really want to start an ed tech company, and not just an ed tech company that focuses on what, that focuses on, I don't know, emotional skill development for 11 to 13-year-olds, right? So it needs to be sort of specific. So that way, if you don't tell them the destination, then why does the short-term path to product manager even make sense if it's not going to lead you to the ultimate destination? And then at the end, you were talking about the network and how the Ross network is going to help you. We can get to this more in a second when I ask you, why do you want an MBA? But one of the issues with that is that if you only focus on what you're going to get from the school, I'm going to get this great network, I'm going to use this great network, but you don't mention what you're going to give back, you run the risk of portraying yourself as a giver, as only a taker and not also a giver. So
that makes sense. By the way, we're also getting a few comments, and some of them are really funny. So I want to read to you one of them if you had anything to talk about that. So
yeah, sure.
Rajiv says, I did mechanical engineering, but after going through the course, I realized that was my biggest mistake I made in my life. So how can I portray it really well? So do you have any thoughts for Rajiv?
Absolutely. So Rajiv, what I would do in your case is if you are asked, walk me through your resume, I would just not even talk about college. I would just start with after college, I started working in X, Y, and Z. Now, if you started working in mechanical engineering after doing it in college, then what you could either gloss over that experience if you think that it doesn't really contribute to your overall career story, or you could focus on what you learned. So you could always say I did mechanical engineering for a year and it taught me some great things about teamwork, but then I wanted to make a switch and I pivoted into finance. You could always say, look, mechanical engineering wasn't for me, but then the reasons you give could be very much related to personality traits that business schools like to see. So you could say, in case the conversation goes that way, which it probably wouldn't unless you lead them there, but in case somehow the interviewer says well, did you love mechanical engineering? I don't want you to lie. I want you to say, well, honestly, it wasn't really my cup of tea because it was very solitary work and I like to work with people. So then at least that way you're showing that you have these intrinsic character traits that business schools are looking for.
Awesome. We have a few more questions too, but I think we can get to one more question. By the way, we have about 120 people watching. And Charles was doing a session right before us, so he's very jealous of the size of our audience.
Excellent.
We can go to the next question if you'd like.
All right, excellent. Okay, so Shovik, you've told me a little bit about where you've been and where you want to go. So why do you need an MBA to get there?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, when I was working for the education startup, I was doing a lot of product management work informally. So I was helping different schools set up ed tech structures. I was trying to brainstorm the best possible tech solutions for those specific schools, and then also leveraging other ed tech companies within India to build customized solutions for the schools. So I was like a pseudo PM for most of them. And I realized that I really liked my work and I wanted to be a more traditional PM. So, but even though I had built the preparedness for those roles, I lacked A, the formal education, and B, the network that I needed to get there. So an MBA provides both of those things, and Ross especially, because Ross has some excellent track record in tech recruiting. So when I spoke to Alumni X and Alumni Y, I realized that both Amazon and Microsoft recruit heavily on campus, and those are my target companies, not only because they have an education focus, but also because their PM role is traditional and strong, something that I want to learn from right at the beginning. And by the way, the second thing I think where an MBA really helps is to leverage the network. Not only Amazon, Microsoft comes to campus, but also Michigan, both with its MBA program and its undergrad program as well, helps me get access to thousands of people who are doing PM jobs today, who I can leverage and learn from, but also help in my job search.
All right, that's great. So at least in this answer, you did at least tie in more of your past into that future goal. So at least I as a listener, am not going to panic that, oh my gosh, he's not going to get this job. So you have done you called yourself a pseudo PM prior to enrolling in business school, and now you want to be a more traditional PM. So you simply glossed over very quickly, well, I need a formal education to do that. So in this situation, what you really need to do to make a strong answer is to specifically identify gaps in your current knowledge that will be specifically filled by an MBA. So what would have been a little bit better would have been for you to say, so as a product manager, and the product managers I've spoken with, they've said that one of the things I'm going to need to understand is things like customer research. And I've never done that before. So Ross has an elective called Understanding the Customer, or whatever it's called.
Right.
And that's going to really help me teach customer. So I want when you guys are answering the why MBA question, to identify a specific gap in your current knowledge. You can't just say, well, I need to learn business. I want you to identify the specific gap, then the specific offering that the school has that fills that gap, and then why in the future you are going to need to know the knowledge that was taught either through that major, through that class, or what have you, because that sort of really closes the narrative and makes it really strong. And as a side note, I know that some business schools are offering a lot more of data analytics. I would caution people to not talk about, like, I can't wait to take your data analytics classes, because a lot of schools also offer masters in data analytics, and you don't want to talk yourself, you don't want the person listening to be like, well, they'd be a great candidate. They shouldn't be applying to a general MBA program. They should be applying to our data analytics masters. So just be cautious in terms of that. You also, you touched upon the network, right? And you talked about, Ross has a great track record in tech recruiting. Again, the schools are sort of hoping that you will take on the responsibility for your own recruiting. So if you say something like, well, I can't wait for your career services office to help get me a job, then that makes them a little nervous of like, oh gosh, is this person going to camp outside of the career services office and harass us? When are you going to get me a job? So, and as I mentioned before, like, just saying like, well, the network is great and here's how it's going to help me, but without talking about how you're going to benefit the network, that's not great. And then finally, you didn't mention any of the extracurricular aspects to business school, which sometimes can be just as, if not more useful in helping you get a job. So frequently, for example, the consulting club, if you want to work in consulting, they will help you practice for consulting interviews or what have you. So you could have mentioned let's say in your case, it would have been the tech club. Yeah. The tech club will give me the benefit of meeting other people who have been PMs prior to business school. And what I can contribute to it is I can help organize social events so that we can bond with each other, because when I was in college, I used to organize social events for my friends. Like, if you need to mention a contribution you're going to make to the club, and then ideally you can tie in that contribution to something concrete you've done in the past, whether it's school or informally or what have you, to show that you can in fact bring something to the table to make the campus community stronger. So those are my comments there.
Do you want to take a few more comments as well?
Sure.
So a bunch of them, I'm trying to select a few. How would you address a gap in the resume where you dedicated 100% of your time to prepare for grad school?
Does that mean like taking the GMAT or what have you?
I think so. Or writing
essays. Okay. So in terms of the gap, I would not proactively mention it. In the interview, if it's a blind interview where the person has only been looking at your resume prior to the interview, they might not have noticed the gap, right? An admissions officer will be sitting down and looking very carefully at the dates, but an interviewer might not even notice the gap. Now, please understand that, again, these are all cultural differences. I understand that in India, it's very common for people to take time off to study for the GMAT or to apply for, like, I think I've heard the civil service exam, I think at some point someone mentioned to me, and there are all these different exams. In the United States, that is very much frowned upon. because the idea is that you're supposed to be filling out your applications and studying for the test and writing the essays while you are also working full time. And if an admissions officer knows that you took time off to dedicate 100% of yourself to, say, studying for the GMAT, then they're going to think, well, that's not fair, because all of our other applicants are working 40, 50, 70-hour work weeks, and they're also studying for the GMAT. So in terms of if you're thinking of doing that and you're watching this, please do not do that. Do not quit your job to apply to graduate school. That is a really not a good idea at all. Now, if you've already done it, and if you get asked about it, then I think what you could do is you could, first of all, if you've done other stuff during this time off, like say doing a little bit of volunteering, you could focus on that aspect of what you've been doing. And then if you do end up saying like, well, actually, I took a few months off to prepare for graduate school, I would then explain, in India, it's very common for people to take time off to study for the tests. And I understand that in the US, that's not very common, but here that's very common. So at least that way, they won't automatically sort of recoil and go like, oh, why did they do that? Ooh, right? At least you're sort of explaining that, for me and for my peers, this is not a sort of completely out of the blue thing. But I would not proactively offer that up.
Awesome. So we have more questions, but why don't we get to one more question, mock it, and then we'll get to some of the user comments.
Sure. We could do, why don't you tell me about your greatest accomplishment?
Sure. So I think my greatest accomplishment was building school leadership models for 15 very different schools. And I'd like to give you a little bit more context before I get into that. So, like right after TFI, I joined this school leadership startup where we focused on school leadership by leveraging technology. And I think to sum up my experience, I'd like to talk about 3 specific things. I think number 1 was first to, comprehend how different these schools were. There were 15 schools in the same geography in Bombay, the city, but they were very different in terms of how they were run, size, management structure, community and school enrollment, and all of these variables are totally different. And as a result, the solutions that could work in these schools was very different as well. So second, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I approached this issue was to first to get to know the school leader, which was the most important stakeholder at that time, to understand where his or her motivations were. Because, like some school leader was strongly motivated by revenue. And there is nothing wrong with, like making a bigger school. And as a result, student enrollment was their biggest piece that they needed to solve. While there were school leaders who were motivated by the quality of learning. So not as much as student enrollment, but a lot on whether students are learning as much as they can. And finally, there were definitely a section of school leaders who really valued improving their infrastructure. So, building things like smart boards, giving students tablets to learn from. So understanding motivations of what really made these school leaders get up and go to work was really crucial in the solution that I was offering to them. And finally, number 3, I would like to tell you a little bit about what the results were from my intervention. So in the 15 schools, for 5 of them, we were able to increase enrollment by 33% by building very strong parent engagement structures where we were telling parents why the school is a great idea, because even basic awareness and education like that was missing from a lot of different segments in the community. For a few different schools, as I mentioned before, we built connections with ed tech companies where we built tech interventions not only through infrastructure and hardware, but also connecting to software platforms where teachers could then be trained and teach their own students by leveraging tech on a daily basis. So building different solutions for different schools really helped me gain success. And I think as an overarching result, all of our schools retained in our program for year 2, which was a big milestone for us because our own internal goal was at least 80% teachers follows through with our program and signs up for the next year. We shot up and we got all of them. So I think my biggest learning from this whole experience was to make sure to understand what really motivates people, and then drive a program that serves those motivations and not my own. So that's sort of been my best accomplishment so far.
All right, great. So this was a stronger answer. So first of all, I'm glad that you ended up explaining. When you first started the answer, you said, well, one of the things I'm proudest of was I built a school leadership model for 15 schools. And immediately in my head, I was like, what on earth is a school leadership model? Like, what does that even mean? So then you did a great job of taking a step back and explaining it in terms that I, as an admissions officer who does not work in your world, could easily understand, right? We leverage technology to help school leaders accomplish various goals. So then you walked me through some of the steps. I understood that different schools, they have differences in how they're run, so the solutions need to be tailored. And then the second step that you mentioned was I got to know each school leader to understand their motivation. This was a great thing to point out, because getting to understand another person's motivation and therefore tailoring what you give to them involves a lot of strong EQ, emotional intelligence. I think where someone else might have gone wrong with this answer is they would have said something like, well, so after I met with the schools, I developed an API that could be accessed through a 4G network. Like, they just would have focused on the technical aspects of what their solution was, or what the technical problem was, right? There was a big see you. Oh, there. Was I gone for a second?
Yeah, I think something strange happened.
Okay. So anyway, I think where someone might have gone wrong with this answer is they would have said like, well, the schools had really bad internet connections, and so I went in and I installed a new 6-cat fiber. I'm making words up, and the problem with that is that, like, a technical solution, I, as an admissions officer, I'm not hiring you to be an engineer for me. I am, quote unquote, hiring you to become a future business leader. So by focusing on, I got to know their motivations, I spoke with them, and I realized that I needed to tailor my approach given the different goals that each school leader had. That really demonstrates that strong empathy and those great persuasion skills, right? Because anyone who's ever managed a team of more than one other person, you will probably realize that different people respond to different management styles. So you've shown that you have that flexibility to help inspire and engage others. The one thing I would improve on this answer is you use the word we a lot. So we were able to increase, we did this, we did that, we were able to get them to stay with us. What would have been a little bit more powerful would have been if you would have focused on first person verbs. And I sat down with the school leader and I asked her what her goals were, and she said this. So for her, we decided to create the following tech solution. But yeah, it was great. And then again, you re-emphasized the key part of the story you were trying to convey is, look at what a flexible persuader I am. So at the end, when you said, well, what my key learning from this was, to understand motivations and to give people personalized solutions, you were really re-emphasizing for the leader that you had developed this skill. So this was in fact a pretty strong answer. So great.
Thank you. So I think we'll be taking a few comments, getting a lot of questions about the questions to ask at the end of the interview. I would go on to say let's focus on the interview first, and we'll get there. So you can maybe ask me that question, and we can critique my questions for you. I think a few questions around GMAT. Asit is asking if they should go on and explain weaknesses in their GMAT or GPA during their interview. And I think a lot of questions around career switching. How do you explain that transition? Because for me, I did have a tech background. I am an engineer. So my goal of becoming a PM, I would say, is somewhat defensible. So for someone who is trying to make a more dramatic transition, what would be your advice for them?
Okay, great. I'll take the first question first. So, do you address a GMAT, a low GMAT, or a low GPA in the interview? I would say do not bring that up at all unless you are asked about it. Usually, interviewers do not. They're looking for reasons to admit you. So they are not going to start asking you nitpicky questions about, like, what was your GMAT score? Or what was your GPA? And how many A's did you get? Or whatever the grading system is for you. How many great grades did you get? I will say in your application, though, you will want to write something called the optional to explain those things, because they will. Don't think that they won't notice, right? If your GMAT's on the lower side, don't think like, oh, well, I'm just going to submit it this way and maybe they won't notice that my GMAT's low. They're going to notice. So you do need to address weaknesses, but do it using the optional essay. Now, if you are asked, I have seen some schools will ask, why shouldn't we admit you? I've seen that. I think that's, what a nasty question that is. Or what do you think is the weakest part of your application? Then maybe you could bring that up, but then quickly, whatever the weakness is that you bring up in your profile, quickly follow it with one of two things. Either number one, things you have been doing to mitigate this weakness, and number two, reasons why the weakness should not concern them. So let's say you had you got low grades in your quantitative classes in college. You could say, well, one of the weaknesses in my application is that I didn't do very well in my quantitative classes in college. However, my job ever since has been highly quantitative. I'm constantly running regression analyses, and I'm constantly building financial models. And so I'm really confident that I will be able to handle the curriculum at Ross. So just sort of quickly, if you have to mention something weak, give them reasons to not be worried about it. Give some other evidence from your background that, in fact, this was just sort of a blip, but look at all these other more recent things I've done that are going to, you don't need to worry about this anymore. And then the second question was around career switchers. So anyone who is an Applicant Lab customer knows that I do not advocate applying to business school with a very, very strong career switch, especially if you are an international student, because getting a work visa is unfortunately, I wish it weren't this way, but it is. It's such a difficult process in the US. So if all of a sudden, let's say you are a teacher at Teach for India, and you say, well, I've taught kindergarten to low-income students for the past 2 years, but now I want to work on Wall Street as an investment banker. First of all, I would advocate that you not say that at all, because you don't want them to worry about, like, oh my gosh, what if we don't get this person this job? Are they going to are they going to go on gmatclub.com and badmouth our career services, and then our school's reputation is going to take a hit? So they're going to worry about, ooh, what if we can't get this person this job? Now, if you've already applied with a career switching story, where I would focus is on two things. Number one, emphasizing those transferable skills that you have that in any way would be attractive to that future employer, even if you kind of have to stretch it a little, right? Like, oh, being a kindergarten teacher has really taught me how to communicate very clearly with other people, and as a banker, I could use that to communicate with my clients, to build strong relationships with my clients. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's better than nothing. And then the other thing I would do is I would try to find what I refer to as your resume twin. Try to find someone else out there, and this requires LinkedIn researching or reaching out to the individual school's professional clubs, and see if you can find someone else out there who was able to make a similar switch, and see if you can talk to them. Because if you say, well, actually, there's a Teach for India LinkedIn group, and I've actually spoken on there to 6 different teachers who used business school to make the exact same transition. Now, I, as the listener, am not panicking about, like, oh, are we going to get this job? Oh, whew, okay, it's possible to get this job. She talked to other people who have done it, so we know it's possible. Whew, so I don't have to worry so much now about whether or not that job is going to be a feasible one to get.
Awesome. So do you want to do one more question, Maria?
Of course, absolutely.
Sounds great.
Okay, so my next question for you, Shovik, is, well, we can do failure or we can do strengths and weaknesses. What do you want to do?
I have a lot of failures.
In that case, okay, so we just talked about your greatest accomplishment with these 15 schools, but not everyone's career is a smooth path. So can you tell me about a time that you failed?
Yeah, for sure. I would love to talk about the first day of my second year as a teacher in Teach for India. And this was a very unusual experience because I was asked to do something that I really didn't want to do. So it was a big conflict. I want to give you a little bit more context. I was coming back after the whole summer vacation, and I was excited to come back to class to see how much progress or lack of my students have made over the summer. And I met with my school principal, and he asked me to he asked me to get my students enrolled in a very expensive after school program. And this was a really tough decision for me because um, on one hand, this was a existing practice within the school, and this is something that my school required their ninth grade students to do. But on the other hand, this was also a question of trust, because the parents of my students, they really trusted me to take the right decisions for them, and I knew that this is a program that A, my students didn't need, and B, my students couldn't afford. So I couldn't really propose this as a possible solution. So I went to talk to my co-teachers, see what they thought, and I realized that putting my ground was a better idea than to just agree with the authority or the status quo. So I said no. But as a result of me saying no, the situation became pretty hard for the next year over for my students and my Teach for India team. So we were, cut off from a few school infrastructure that was very important for both my class and my co-teachers. And B, to do a lot of different interventions with your students, you do need school leader buy-in. And because I did not get that buy-in, I was cut off from those things as well. So yeah, so in hindsight, I feel I should have looked at the situation a little bit more holistically. Maybe I should have taken time to negotiate an arrangement rather than saying a flat out no, and that would have eased my year after and made it a lot better as an experience for both me and my students. Well, the second, what I think was even more important, was to really get more buy-in from other teachers in the school as supporters of my decisions. I think that's something I'm learning in business school a lot, is like how influence works in a big organization. And I think just doing it, just doing the whole thing solo really hurt me at the end. And that's something that I am cautious of when I have to take a strong decision in the future.
Okay, great. So this was again a pretty strong answer. And what made it strong? A couple of things. There were two key things that made this a strong answer. Number one, you actually took responsibility for the failure in question. It is very common, and this is human nature, so I don't blame anyone for doing this, but it's very common if you're asked about a failure to try to think of something that either isn't really a failure, like, oh, one of my failures is that I'm too much of a perfectionist, right? And it's like, oh, come on, that's not really a failure. You're just trying to sneak a brag into something negative. Or the other biggest mistake people usually make with a failure question is that they throw other people under the bus. So because they don't want to show a vulnerability, it's human nature, right? You don't want others to know where you're vulnerable or where you might actually have a weakness. So I've seen a lot of people will frequently say things like, well, I missed a deadline once, but it was because, there was this person over in graphic design who just, she was so lazy, didn't get me the assets I needed in time. And so the whole thing fell apart, but it was really this other person's fault. So what made your answer strong was that, number one, it was a real failure. And part of how I know it's a real failure is that after you described what you did, you really explained to me what the consequences were, right? You were cut off. For you and your staff were cut off. The leader wasn't buying into any of your new ideas. And so that made me, since I wasn't there and I don't work in your world, that made me really realize, like, wow, this was an actual failure. You admitted the things that you did that were wrong, right? Again, you didn't gloss over them or say, like, well, my principal was in a really bad mood that day and, she's just so difficult. Like, no, you actually took the responsibility. And then what you did is at the end you explained what you learned from it, which that is key, right? To show that you have a growth mindset, because we all make mistakes. We all have failures. Trust me. What's important though is that we learn from them and we grow from them. Two quick things that could have made this answer just a smidge better. Number one, you started off the introduction, and I think this is something important for all of us to keep in mind, that the first few seconds of an answer are going to set the tone or are going to make that first impression of what your answer is. And so you started off by saying, the first day of my second year as a teacher, I was asked to do something I didn't want to do. So right off the bat, a million questions flooded into my mind, like, is this person difficult? Does this person have a petulant attitude? Are they like, oh, I'm not going to do that, right? Do they think they're too good? I wasn't sure where the story was going. So I was like, oof, like, what is this? What am I about to hear? Like, is this someone who thinks that, I'm not going to do that gross work that you asked me to do? In fact, that wasn't the case. So instead, I want everyone to think about, what is that lead in sentence you're going to use to set the stage? So in your case, I would have said, well, I had a failure once when I faced an ethical dilemma. Because in this case, it really was. You were not sure, do you tell your students to sign up for this expensive after school thing, knowing that your boss wanted you to do it, knowing that it would make your school more money, but your conscience wouldn't let you do it. So I would phrase it as, well, I once had this ethical dilemma, because then that way you're introducing the story in a way that is a little bit nicer to you. And the other way that this could have been a little improved is, if in the future you applied this learning to another situation, then after you described the lessons that you learned, you could have said, and actually, I had an opportunity recently to learn from this. I mean, this is really the thing. This, while this was a difficult lesson to learn, I'm kind of glad that I learned it, because later on, when I was trying to institute these new edtech solutions into the 15 schools that I mentioned earlier, that's when I knew how important it was to get buy-in. And so I'm glad that I had this lesson so early in my career, because it helped me later on to achieve something better. So I call that the silver lining technique, to try to put like a positive end result on something that maybe wasn't so positive at the time.
Awesome. That sounds great. I did remember to, point out that my school leader was kind of a jerk, because I wanted you to comment on the fact that I can't say that. But I totally forgot. So maybe the next.
Oh, okay. I was like, I don't remember you saying that your school leader was a jerk.
No. I did.
Okay.
A few questions. So is it you're gonna love this. Is it a good idea to bring up IQ scores when discussing strengths? Not sure if it can come off as braggy, but I have a genuine passion for problem/puzzle solving.
Yeah, please do not mention your IQ. You got a 780 on the GMAT. Please don't, or if you're a member of Mensa, please don't bring those things up, for not just because it sounds braggy, which it totally does, but because business schools are interested in people who are going to become future business leaders. And if there is one thing the research has shown over and over again, is that people who tend to advance are people who understand other people. So it's not about IQ for business schools, it's about EQ. And especially the interviews primarily exist to determine your EQ. Because the other people in the admissions office, they use the GMAT score in your grades to get a rough idea of how smart you are. The reason they have the interview is to learn more about you, specifically how strong your EQ is. So if you genuinely love solving puzzles, maybe that could be something that you save at the end. If they say something like, so what are some of your hobbies? Then maybe you could say, well, I really love solving puzzles, and then maybe give me a fun, likable example of you doing that. Like, for example, I every single day I fill out the New York Times crossword puzzle. It's like a ritual for me. It's just something I do every day. Something that's like kind of nice. If you say I have a really high IQ and I'm super good at solving puzzles, that's suicide. Sorry.
All right, awesome. So we do have a few more questions, but do you want to do one last before we move to a few comments before we close out?
You know what? Can we do a couple of more of the audience questions?
Yeah, for sure. So somebody has the question on, and Nimisha Shank, he wants to know, what thing should I mention while stating what I can give back to my MBA class as well as school?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, first of all, the strongest things to mention are things that you have had some sort of previous experience doing. So, for example, if you say, well, I can't wait to help organize the real estate conference. I mean, look, that's fine. It's better than nothing, right? Saying some sort of a contribution that you want to make. But it's even stronger if you say, in college, I helped organize a conference for our college's entrepreneurial society. And so I'd love to bring what I learned from that to help organize the whatever conference at your school. Another little trick that I advise, one of the things I really advocate a lot in Applicant Lab in the to-do list module is reaching out to current students. And that's not simply so that you can name drop. That's not the reason at all. But think about how much stronger that answer would be if you had said, I spoke to the leader of the medical business conference. I spoke to the president of that club, and she said that she wished that the medical conference had more of a biotech angle to it, because last year it dealt primarily with hospital management and large pharmaceuticals, but they really didn't have a chance to do a biotech track to the conference. Well, I work in biotech, so I would be happy to invite the CEO of my company in biotech to come and speak at the conference and help organize that portion of the conference. That's another way where, how much stronger is that answer that you spoke with a student based on that conversation, you proactively identified a place where, boom, here's exactly what I'm going to do and exactly how I'm going to contribute, and then talk about that. So that's sort of like one of the best answers. So that way you're not just making up a fake need that the club might not have. You're actually coming up with an actual one. And if that doesn't work, look at the different titles that the clubs have. Sometimes they have like VP of corporate relationships or director of education. Pick one of those specific titles. Don't say, I'm going to be a leader in the tech club. That's too generic. Come up with something specific.
All right. So the next question is how to answer why I'm best suited to do the long-term goal as opposed to other people.
Okay. So one of the things I talk about in Applicant Lab is the importance of developing the hook for your career vision. So one of the things you have to do is look at pursuing anything in the long term requires a ton of passion. I can tell you as an entrepreneur, if it weren't for passion, I would have quit Applicant Lab 7 years ago. So you have to have a lot of passion for it. So one of the ways you can describe how well suited you are for a particular career vision is to really find a way to express what that passion is. What's the origin of that passion? Why do you care so much about improving the pharmaceutical industry? Like what drives that passion? And then the other thing is, again, bringing up the facets of your background that will be attractive or will be useful in the future. Obviously, you're not going to know everything. If you knew everything, you wouldn't need an MBA. But if you have some sort of benefits, like, oh, I currently understand, I work for ZS Associates, let's say. And so based on that, I've learned a lot about digital marketing in pharmaceutical companies. So in the long term, I'll be able to apply that skill to helping grow the pharmaceutical company I work for in the future. So linking it to your something or some things in your past.
Awesome. I think we can take maybe one more question. Well, somebody says, say apples if you don't know why you are watching this. I'm going to ignore that.
Apples? Why am I here? No, just kidding.
So what are some of the best ways to handle a weakness question? I think we went over this in failures, but weakness specifically, can you give us a few examples of what would be some weaknesses that I can talk about?
So I think the weakness question and the failure question are sort of two sides of this. Like they're very much intertwined. So if you get asked about your weaknesses, pick something that you have actively taken steps to improve. So let's say you've got 10 weaknesses, right? I also have many, many weaknesses. But for the purposes of the application or the interview, I would pick the ones that I have actually taken concrete steps to improve. So that way I don't just say like, well, I'm not really good at prioritizing my time, and then just leaving it at that. But saying something like, I used to not be one of the things I've been working on is prioritizing my time. Earlier in my career, I missed this really important deadline. It was really embarrassing. So ever since then, I have started using something called the Pomodoro technique, or I have a calendar online where I map out every 15 minutes what I'm supposed to be doing, or whatever it is that you've done to mitigate that weakness. So again, you're showing that you have a growth mindset, that like, yeah, I have weaknesses, you have weaknesses, we all have weaknesses, but here are the steps I'm taking to not make this weakness be such a drain on my career. That would be the number one thing I would say, instead of just being like, well, I've got this weakness, this is who I am, deal with it. Like, no, you want to demonstrate that growth mindset.
Awesome. So we do have a bunch of questions, but I think we're out of time. Maria, what do you think? You want to take another one?
I can stay.
Okay, awesome. So similar question on strengths, like how do you communicate strength without coming off as a braggy individual? And also we do want to get to what are the few questions that are safe but makes you look good if you want to ask at the end.
Yeah. Okay, so talking about your strengths, this is one of the ways you can soften it is you can say something like, well, I've heard, my boss has often told me that one of my strengths is blah, blah, blah. Or, in my annual reviews, it usually highlights X as one of my strengths. So that way you're not saying, let me tell you what I am awesome at. It's everything. Like, no, you're bringing it to, like, you're saying another person has told me that this is one of my strengths. And it's fine to just say, well, I think that creativity is one of my strengths. That's not braggy in and of itself, and then pick a story to illustrate that. Just like with the weaknesses, you don't just want to say, well, my 3 strengths are creativity, analytics, and people management, and then have nothing else to offer. You want to say, one of my strengths is creativity. So for example, when I saw that people were charging $10,000 for MBA admissions consulting, I thought there has to be a better way, and I came up with Applicant Lab, right? So you want to provide concrete proof that you actually have those strengths, because otherwise anyone could say anything about themselves, but having actual proof to back it up is really important. So those are my 2 things. You could always say, I've heard from others, or, even something like, I was really honored last year when I won the award for most creative Deloitte consultant because, and I got the award because of blah, blah, blah. So that's a way you can soften it.
Most creative Deloitte consultant. That's tough.
I'm making that up off the top of my head.
I have a few very close friends from Deloitte, so I'm not going to say anything bad about Deloitte. Deloitte is harder to get into than Harvard.
Deloitte is delightful.
Awesome. So do you want to maybe take a few examples of questions that people can ask at the end?
Yes, I was just going to say, I think we still need to do. So first of all, the questions at the end, I can tell you more easily what not to do. Do not ask any question at all that puts them on the defensive or makes them think that they're not your first choice school. Until you have an acceptance letter in your hand, you need to treat every school as if though it's your first choice school. So don't ask any questions about things like, well, some of my friends told me that your career services office does a really bad job with placing international candidates. Can you tell me about that? Or, one of my friends said that the case method is actually a terrible way to learn finance. What are your thoughts on that? Like, no, don't say anything that might put them on the defensive. Even if you secretly harbor these doubts about a program, now is not the time to air those doubts. Wait till you get that acceptance letter and then start asking those difficult questions. So in terms of questions that I think are good to ask at the end, anything that is positive, that will leave them feeling warm and fuzzy. So that way you end the interview on kind of a high note, on kind of a warm and fuzzy note. So you could say something like, well, I know all the reasons that I want to go to Cornell. Like, I've already told you about them, but what are the reasons you work at Cornell? Like, what brought you to Cornell? Or what are some of your favorite stories about student entrepreneurship? Or, because sometimes the admissions officers will follow up with people who get in. If it's an ex-student, a current student, or an alumnus, you could say something like, the class I'm most looking forward to is consumer behavior. What was your favorite class when you were a student there? Or what is your favorite class now that you're a student? So asking positive questions like, what do they like about the experience? What is their favorite whatever? Another very safe question is, what advice do you have for new students enrolling in your program? That's one that a lot of people like to answer because everyone has advice and everyone loves to give advice and hear themselves talk. So that could be a good question. And then finally, another don't that I forgot a second ago is don't ask any question that can be answered by the website. So please don't say something like, what exchange opportunities are there? Or, what operations classes do you guys have? Like nothing like that, because then it's going to show that you really haven't done your research, which is going to tell them that they're not your first choice, which means they're going to probably reject you. So every school wants to feel loved. So make sure that the questions you ask don't make them question your love for the school.
That sounds great. We do have about 130 people watching. This was a great session. And Maria, I don't know how you felt about that, but I think we should do this more regularly. Lots of people. And maybe we can take some of the questions in the next session as well. We have a few too. One of the questions is sort of baffling to me. Is like how to answer what makes you a unique individual. I don't know which school would ask that question, but I guess it's pretty common.
Yeah, I can. Do you want me to do that now, or are we going to say that for another session?
If you want, and if you have the time, absolutely.
So first of all, don't stress out about being asked what makes you unique. I think when I give essay advice for how to handle the uniqueness essay, I say the one thing that is not unique is that everyone hates the uniqueness question. So if you get that question, you're like, oh, I hate this question. You're not alone. Everyone hates that question. So don't stress yourself out and think to yourself, what does make me unique? Well, there really isn't like huge amounts of uniqueness unless you're like a ballerina, astronaut, professional soccer player. Most people in the applicant pool are not like 1,000% unique. So I don't worry about that. What I would emphasize is anything you've done, especially if you have like a technical job, I think you can emphasize, I work in engineering, or I'm a financial analyst, right? If you have sort of like a lower level job, you can use this time to highlight experiences that you've had that are uncommon for people at your level, especially any interpersonal experiences. So let's say you're a finance analyst, maybe 99% of your job is just building spreadsheets, but maybe you were invited to attend a pitch meeting with a major client. You can say like, well, on top, one of the things that makes me unique amongst other financial analysts is that I've actually had client interaction, which is not very common at the analyst level. Or, I'm an engineer. I actually deal directly with the client, and I'm actually interfacing with them, or I've had the opportunity to lead a team, which isn't common for someone at my level. That could be something. It gives you a chance to reinforce those experiences that you've had that are the sorts of experiences that you're looking for. You can also think about other facets of your background. For example, you can almost turn a weakness into a strength in this case. For example, let's say you've jumped around a little bit in your career instead of having a very linear career path. You can say, well, very few people have the experiences that I've had working for both a marketing agency and a unicorn startup. And I bring both of those perspectives in. That could be another one. I've had experience both as a venture capitalist and as an entrepreneur, right? So I've been on both sides of the table. But I would just use it as an opportunity to sort of highlight those strengths that you have. But then the onus is on you to explain to them why that's unique, right? Very few other analysts at Deloitte have had the opportunity to do whatever. That's how I would address it.
Awesome. I guess that's pretty much all the questions. You're getting some good, solid thank yous.
Oh, thanks, guys.
Awesome. So, Maria, this was a great session. I hope we get to do this again. And until then, I'll see you soon.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you so much. And thanks, everyone, for attending today. It means a lot to me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.